The Indiana Hoosiers game control the Washington Huskies, winning 31-17 to move on to 8-0 for the first time since 1967 and only the second time in school history. It has been so long since Indiana has fielded a great team. Not just good, like in 2019 or 2020, but a great team. And I documented in a video that I released last week that Indiana is dominant. They are elite, even when you factor in their strength of schedule, statistically speaking, at least. And what was so refreshing to watch, to witness in this game, is that regardless of whether Curtis Rourke is the Hoosiers starting quarterback or it's Taven Jackson or really whoever it is, as long as they are a quarterback and can throw a functional forward pass every so often, Indiana is still a physical football team who plays good defense, who tackles well, who blocks well. They're sound, they're fundamental, they're disciplined. Really, they're just well coached. This game was encouraging because we now know, I thought this was going to be the case entering this game, in fact, to a more extreme degree than it turned out to be, that regardless of whether it was Curtis Rourke or Taven Jackson, Indiana would dominate. Well, I think it's clear that Curtis Rourke is the better quarterback, but regardless, it's encouraging to know that Curtis Rourke is not the whole team. He's not even close to the whole offense. And some people doubted that even after the Nebraska game, which at that point I can't really help you. But it's becoming clearer and clearer as the season goes on and even as the schedule gets tougher that this Indiana team is legit. They are 8-0, 5-0 in Big Ten Conference play right now. If they beat Michigan State this coming Saturday, I think that's the first time in program history that Indiana wins 9 games. Correct me if I'm wrong. They only need 2 more wins to get, 10 wins, 3 more to get 11. They could win out. They could, but we're getting a little bit too ahead of ourselves. And I want to break down this game, this matchup, talk about Washington as well, because Washington could be what Indiana is, but should be put in all caps, italicized, and boldened, because Washington is not fundamentally sound, and they have a variety of issues. But before we further dive into this matchup, I want to ask you to please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. Hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new college football content here on College Football with Sam. Comment your reaction to this game down in the comments section below. And share this video and this channel around to other college football fans who appreciate college football and who are passionate about it like we are. Because if they are passionate, they will enjoy College Football with Sam. We are the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube. And with your help, we just hit 20,000 subscribers, so there will be a giveaway for you guys to thank you for your support coming out in these next few days/weeks. But they will love this channel, and we will become the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube and the best college football channel on YouTube, thanks to your help. Also, please join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment so that you can talk with me and my subscribers and the College Football with Sam community 24/7 about college football. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, you can check out my Patreon page and sign up as a paid member or purchase merchandise from my merchandise store. And the links to those are both in the description and down below in the pinned comment. But liking, sharing, subscribing, joining the Discord server, commenting, hitting the notification bell, all of those things you can do for free, and those help out the channel the most. So thank you for your support, and let's continue with analyzing this matchup. And again, it makes me smile and it makes me happy watching Indiana, because Indiana they're a good team. They're physical. They're a Big Ten team. And I know people have already mentioned this, and maybe it's a bit overplayed, but I don't think it is. When I watch Curt Cignetti coach, when I watch his facial expressions, it reads Nick Saban. It does. And I miss that. I miss it. I don't see that much in college football because, well, Nick Saban's a GOAT, the type of coaches that produce at that high level, that are elite, are few and far between, no matter what year of college football it is. And Nick Saban just retired after last year. And Jim Harbaugh, who wasn't even close to Nick Saban, but still an elite head football coach, he left for the Chargers. So at the top of the food chain, college football had some pretty big losses in coaching. So it's refreshing to see that regardless of, well, the coaching turnover that occurs in this sport, you find new coaches that can rise to the top. And in some cases, float to the top passively, like when you take over a really good job and you, I guess that may not be the best analogy, but anyway, like when with Ryan Day, because floating to the top doesn't sound very endearing, but I hope you understand that what I mean by that is you take over a good program and you maintain it. In fact, maybe you help it continue its upward trajectory. I feel like that's what Ryan Day's really done at Ohio State. And then there's other times where you fight the downward pressure of the water and you rise to the top. And that's what Indiana has done this year. And in this game, that's what they did. They faced adversity, but despite averaging fewer yards per play than Washington, they won the points per play margin battle, which is typically indicative of the fact that you won the game. They had a 0.158 points per play margin, averaged 4.4 yards per play. Washington averaged 5.2 yards per play, but they had a points per play margin of negative 0.158 because they threw a pick six. And also because Washington went 1 of 3 on fourth down and at times just couldn't produce. They also threw another interception too, so they lost the turnover battle, lost the first down battle, lost the time of possession battle. Indiana was much more methodical than Washington was. Meanwhile, Washington was a bit boom and also a bit bust too, while Indiana was pretty much in the middle. They had a few big plays, but this offense that has been high-flying, high-octane, that has produced at an elite level all year, was a bit restrained, a bit simplified, not as high-performing, not as elite or explosive as I thought it would be in this game. I think I overestimated how good Taven Jackson was, and I think he's good, but I thought he was going to play almost exactly like Curtis Rourke. I thought that there wouldn't be that much of a difference, and there is. But regardless of that, Indiana won the turnover battle. They were 9 of 17 on third and fourth down, while Washington was 4 of 14. A lot of that's on Indiana's defense. Good job for them. And Washington had 5 penalties for 33 yards. Indiana had one penalty for 5 yards. I forget if that was a false start or an offsides. I think it was a false start. But Indiana won in the fundamentals, and they were the more disciplined team. They were the better coached team. Washington at times looked like they had more talent, and I think some people mistook that because I talked with someone who mid-game said they thought Washington would win because they looked better. I think Washington looked more talented, specifically at the skill positions, mainly because of their quarterback, Will Rogers, also Denzel Boston, who may have been the best wide receiver on the field, and Jonah Coleman individually is probably the best running back on the field. But Indiana is deeper. They're better coached, they're more methodical, they're better built to win at a high level, not just nationally, but especially in the Big Ten with their underrated offensive line and underrated defense, which those two positions for Indiana do not get enough love, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But first and foremost, I want to get to Washington because we talk about the winners last. We save the best for last on this channel. And as for Washington, it's another game filled with horrid errors. One more game that's just bleh. It's like a diarrhea sound effect, if I could play one for you. Washington State was one of these games. Rutgers, who has gone on a just epic march of 4 losses after 4 wins. They beat Washington, despite Washington outgaining them by nearly 200 yards, if not more. It was more than 200 yards, actually. Against Michigan, Washington made some pretty horrid mistakes, missing 2 field goals, throwing a critical pick that really wasn't on Will Rogers, but still didn't need for that to happen, giving up momentum entering halftime and having Michigan take the lead after a horrific start. You go into The Iowa game after beating Michigan in a game where it seemed like both teams wanted to lose. Iowa puts a 40 burger on you. And then there's this game. Out of the bye, what happens? Well, Washington, I thought, had a good game plan. I think Washington's coaching staff, by the way, is great on a variety of fronts, but for some reason, they can never play to their A-plus game. They can't do it. And maybe this is their A-plus game, what they did against Indiana, because Indiana's pretty damn good. I think at the very worst, Indiana is a top 10 team when healthy, and at the very best when healthy, they could be the nation's best team. I don't think they are, especially with the level of blue chip talent they do have. They would be a vast exception to the rule for them to be the best team in America. But if they're going to be that with the talent they have, this would be the year, given how down it is and also given how equal it is at the top. And by top, I mean the top 10, because typically at the end of every season, historically in college football, you really do have only 2, 3, or 4, and some years even one team where in hindsight you're like, okay, those are the actual national title contenders. Other teams got weeded out as the season went on. But Washington has, it's just so many unforced errors, mistakes that they make. And Indiana, look, they forced those 2 turnovers. The first interception was tipped by a defensive lineman, and D'Angelo Pons collected it and returned it to the house. Good on him for being able to catch the ball, being able to keep his eyes on the prize, the ball, and then take it to the house. And then the other interception, which I think was also collected by D'Angelo Pons, if I'm not mistaken, was just beautiful coverage that was well executed. And yes, the other pick was collected by D'Angelo Pons, who has been a key incoming transfer for Indiana, has done very well this season. And we'll talk about him some more. But Washington had 318 total yards. They only got 17 points off of it. They outgained Indiana in total yards, yet lost by double digits and let Indiana cover the spread. And they were down by 17 points in the fourth quarter. They kicked a field goal with 6 minutes left, and at that point you feel like, yeah, unless Indiana performs a masterful choke job, this game's over. Washington was 3 of 11 on third down, 1 of 3 on fourth down, and they threw 2 picks and technically had 2 more turnovers just on downs because they went, again, 1 of 3 on fourth down. Just not a good game by the Huskies. But you know who did have a good game? Jonah Coleman. And Jonah Coleman carries this offense. I've watched him, whether it's against Rutgers, whether it's against Michigan, against Iowa, against Indiana in this game, just do so well when oftentimes the supporting cast surrounding him is not the best supporting cast on the field, at least. He had 19 carries for 104 rushing yards, averaged 5.5 yards per carry, and he had a long carry of 46. You factor that out, and he didn't have the most consistent day, of course, but he did have some pretty huge breakaway runs that kept Washington's drives alive. By comparison, Indiana's best running back on the day, Justice Ellison, who had 10 more carries, 29 carries total, only had 19 more yards, 29 carries for 123 yards, 4.2 yards per carry, a touchdown, long of 12. And Indiana's ground attack, it got going, and it was very impressive, but it got going later in the football game. Early on in the football game, they were struggling a little bit against Washington, who I think put up a pretty good defensive effort. But Jonah Coleman he's an X-factor player. I don't know if I'd go as far to say that he's a non-negotiable, but I'm pretty close to saying that he is, because in multiple games this year, he has produced against Iowa, 8.9 yards per carry, against Michigan, 4.4 yards per carry, Rutgers, 9.3 yards per carry, Indiana, 5.5 yards per carry. He has averaged at minimum 4.4 yards per carry in any game this season. His worst game by a yards per carry standpoint was against Michigan, who we all know has several NFL players on that defensive line. So 785 rushing yards in the season, 5 rushing touchdowns, 6.7 yards per carry, 125 receiving yards, not rushing yards. I don't know if they use him enough. I know that obviously Jed Fish wants to do things a certain way and wants to be more quarterback focused and passing offense focused, since that was his MO. That was his go-to, the center of his offense at Arizona, and still is at Washington, and I understand that. But using Jonah Coleman more might help them with some of their red zone and scoring woes that they have incurred upon themselves ever since the beginning of this season. And finally, for Washington, the defense did their job. This loss was on the offense. It was on Will Rogers having the worst game of his career at Washington. Will Rogers had no touchdown passes, 2 picks, 202 passing yards, 19 of 26. That sounds good, but then you look at no touchdowns, 2 interceptions, a 14.6 quarterback efficiency rating, 5 carries for negative 21 yards because Indiana got to him 3 times. And that game was, again, worst of his career at Washington. It was the first time all season he had a sub 50 QBR. His next, not the first, it was the first time he had a sub 40. Actually, no. He's been up and down. I'm forgetful about that. But his worst game of the season before this was when he had a 35.9 QBR against Weber State. And, man, over 20 points worse on the quarterback efficiency scale. 14.6 is pretty low. That is a pretty awful game. And it was his second worst game by passer rating. His worst was against Iowa, where he had a 116.7 passer rating. He had a 123 passer rating against Indiana. So, yeah, Indiana's defense, I think, is in pretty good company when you look at how Will Rogers has, well, performed against other defenses not named Indiana and how he's performed against Indiana's defense. But speaking of defense, Washington's did their job. 316 or 312 opponent total yards, 24 opponent offensive points, because remember, one of those touchdowns was a pick six, was a pretty big factor in deciding this game. 188 opponent rushing yards. That's a lot, but Washington held them to 3.6 yards per carry. And honestly, I relate a lot of that to the fact that Indiana has recruited well on the offensive line and developed well there, not just this year, but last year. Bob Bobstad was a holdover from Tom Allen's staff that Curt Cignetti, well, kept. And there's a reason for that, because this is one of the better offensive lines in the Big Ten. Washington's defensive line lost a lot of production from last year, breaking in new bodies, and they have a new set of assistants, the defense does. So I'm not going to exactly pin that on the defense, especially when they basically neutered Indiana's rushing offense for the first half and for much of this game. Now, Indiana averaged 0.437 points per play, but a large part of that, again, circle back, was the pick six. And also has something to do with that Washington's offense couldn't produce. Whenever it felt like Washington stole momentum away from Indiana, they just gave it right back, or maybe more accurately, Indiana took it right back. I think that this loss is on the offense, and also the fact that this is year one of what is going to be a long rebuild, at least relative to what some college football fans are now expecting with the transfer portal and NIL. Unlike Indiana, whose rebuild happened like this for a variety of reasons, that's not going to happen at Washington, again, due to a plethora of separate reasons. Let's talk about Indiana here, and I think you've already figured out that I'm more excited to talk about Indiana than Washington. I am, because Washington right now is, they're 4-4, 2-3 in conference. At this point, they're fighting to get to a bowl game. Indiana's fighting for bigger and better things. And they're one of the best stories, and in fact, not one of the best. They're the best story in college football this year. You think of BYU. They're undefeated, and good for them. They're a legit team, by the way. Really good defense in terms of coaching. Their offense is underrated explosivity, and Jake Retzlaff is fun to watch. You look at Iowa State. Iowa State is on the precipice of having their best season in school history by wins and losses, and probably just by quality of team, too. You look at Colorado. I'm naming a lot of Big 12 teams here, but they only have 2 losses, and they're ranked inside the top 25 right now. And I think Deion Sanders has actually done a pretty good job of rebuilding that program. You look at SMU. You look at Duke, who, if they made the 2-point conversion, they'd only have 1 loss and probably be ranked in the top 25. You look at Pittsburgh, undefeated, 7-0, after bouncing back from a 3-9 season, after having a 3-9 record last year where Notre Dame hung a 50 burger on them with the awful offense they had last year, with the overrated offense at least. Awful may be an exaggeration. But all of those stories, all of them, even Texas A&M's story, because they're one of the hottest teams in college football right now, even Vanderbilt's story, that's all overshadowed by this Indiana team, because this Indiana team is undefeated. This Indiana team right now, oh man, when you look at points per play, when you look at points per play margin, when you look at their offense and compare it to one of the most productive offenses in the country in the Big Ten and Ohio State statistically, they're battling right there. They are one of the nation's best teams, and that is in juxtaposition to last year's Indiana squad that was ultimate gutter trash and a complete waste of talent. Speaking of, well, this is an awkward transition, but really it relates to what I said in waste of talent, because Brennan Sorsby's good, and Tom Allen and his staff horrifically misused him last year. Like, if Sorsby stayed at Indiana, I don't think he would have been as good as Curtis Rourke was this year, and maybe I'm wrong on that, but he would have been very good. And clearly Rourke's improvement and Indiana's improvement overall is more so to do with coaching than players. I was wrong about the quarterback situation, though, and I want to admit that, because I predicted Indiana to win 45-14. The score for Washington was pretty close, but I was 2 touchdowns short on the Indiana side of things. I was. And while Indiana led for the whole game and kind of controlled the game was never in doubt. They never trailed, for example. Never. So that streak's continuing. It's clear that Taven Jackson is not as good as Curtis Rourke. He does some things better. Like, he's more athletic, so there's more mobility with him. That's why you saw that rushing touchdown that he had. But 11 of 19 for 124 yards, a touchdown, a pick, 6.5 yards per attempt, 11.3 yards per completion. I think that Indiana needs Curtis Rourke to beat Ohio State, for example. They need him if they want to win a playoff game or go on a playoff run, to be more precise, because maybe if Indiana gets very lucky and hosts some team that is worse in talent than they are from a blue chip ratio standpoint or similar, or they get a home playoff game in winter against a non-elite team, well then, with how well they're coached and the fact that Taven Jackson's good, he's not even close to bad, he's a good quarterback, well, maybe they can win a playoff game regardless of that. But going on the road in the shoe against Ohio State, who doesn't have much margin for error if they want to achieve all their goals, that's going to be tough. Going on a playoff run is going to be tough. And you know that Curt Cignetti, for him, the standard for Indiana is to just go 1-0, is to keep winning and winning and winning, to push this team to their limit and see what that limit is, to test the waters. And to do that, to maximize Indiana's chances of winning, they need Curtis Rourke. They do. And that's my opinion. And maybe I'll be wrong there. But based off of what I saw in this game, it's clear that Rourke's the better quarterback. There's a reason why he won that starting job, a very clear reason. But Jackson was serviceable, 11 of 19 for 124 yards, 6.5 yards per attempt, a touchdown, a pick that was somewhat on him because he threw it into tight coverage, but it wasn't totally his fault. It wouldn't be as egregious as like the Jack Tuttle near interception against Illinois where he threw it literally right to the DB. It wasn't even close to that bad. It was into tight coverage, but he also made some throws into tight coverage that were completed and throws that were perfect. So you saw that he has elite upside, but Rourke can be consistently elite in the passing game and make better decisions, while Jackson does have a much lower floor. Omar Cooper Jr. had one reception for 42 yards and a touchdown. That was, I don't know if it was a slant. It looked like a deeper route than a slant. Maybe it was an in route of some kind, and he took it to the house. He broke a tackle and took it right to the house. Perfect throw, perfect ball, perfect route. Again, it's the fundamentals and the strategy and the scheme that all go Indiana's way, because those are things that they can control. They can control their scheme. They can control their discipline. They do a miraculous job of working inside of their limitations and pushing their limitations. They color inside the box completely. Indiana does, and then they make these nice designs around the box to make it look even better, to make it more artistic and more exciting. That's what Indiana's staff does with their team, and it's absolutely incredible. I do think, again, that Taven Jackson is a good quarterback. I do, and they can win all of the games on the rest of their schedule outside of maybe that Ohio State game with him as their quarterback. But to maximize their chances of beating Ohio State, which at this point is the only game where Indiana won't be favored in for the rest of the season, and the only game where I'm not going to pick them to win by double digits at this point, just being honest here. I do think that they need Rourke to maximize their ceiling. So I was wrong about the quarterback situation. It's just a kind of grain of salt take. I'm not mad that I was wrong about it because, well, Indiana won and they covered, but I just wanted to be honest and admit that there. Like, there's a reason why Rourke is the starter, and Indiana is a deep team, but they don't have unlimited depth like some of the GOAT teams that we've seen in the past. Indiana's defense, though, this was the most impressive unit in my mind on the field, was Indiana's defense. And I would say specifically their secondary, because, again, like in the Nebraska game, I have seen 2 weeks in a row at noon Eastern time, on kickoff, in a big audience where, with all the lights on them, all the pressure, Indiana tackles well. They do the best they can in coverage. They are willing to give you yards, but they rarely break. Their defense is of Big Ten caliber. It's time to talk about that. 318 opponent yards allowed, 17 points allowed. Washington only averaged 0.279 points per play, which is pretty good. Obviously, Washington scored 17 points. It's not like Indiana shut them out, but still good performance. Washington has scored more points than that on defenses that have much better talent and that were projected to finish higher. They only allowed 116 opponent rushing yards and 3.7 yards per carry. Indiana had 3 sacks on the day, 6 TFLs, 3 passes defended, 2 interceptions, a pick 6, and they held Will Rogers to a season-low QBR and a second-to-worst performance in passer rating. And it was impressive to watch. I mean, they are so good at tackling. Take 2023 Michigan, for example. That team was always tackling well. They were always right place, right time. Always, of course, is an exaggeration. No defense is perfect, but they were so fundamentally sound that the upside was really just icing on the cake, because it was so rare to see a coverage breakdown or rare to see a busted tackle on that Michigan defense. It was very rare. In fact, it was so rare that when it happened, you thought it was problematic. That's kind of what I fell for last year, where I said that, Michigan's defense would have about 1 or 2 big passing plays that they allowed per game. Even against Rutgers or Minnesota, they allowed a deep passing touchdown or a deep passing play. And honestly, I kind of got sucked into the fact that maybe that was a problem. And at the end of the year when they played Washington, well, they allowed 1 or 2, but that's against Washington. You're not gonna force them to have 0 explosive plays through the air. That's impossible. They held Milroe to no explosive passing plays. Ohio State had some, but Ohio State played their best game of the season. Their O-line actually looked good when it was rough all year. And they have elite receivers and tight ends. So all in all, what I'm trying to say is, not that this is a generational defense like Michigan's of last year, or Ohio State's or Penn State's, or maybe Iowa's of last year, or Iowa's of 22, or Georgia's of 21, or Alabama's or LSU's of 2011, or Alabama's of 2017 or 2016, or whatever season under Nick Saban you want to mention, because they had a ton of generational defenses. What I'm trying to say is that they have the fundamentals down. They do. And they mimic the generational defenses in that way, that they are very well coached and that they are in the right positions. They don't have the upside or the talent or the depth of those defenses, but they have the fundamentals down like those do. And therefore, you're going to see Indiana's defense climb in rankings and in performance through the rest of the season, even though they are playing the toughest part of their schedule, because they have things figured out. And therefore, they can begin to knock down some of those finer details since they have the little things done. They have the fundamentals. And I'm very impressed with Indiana this year. And their defense stepped up when their offense had an off game due to a injury to one of their best players, if not their best player, on that side of the ball on the offense. And finally, last but not least, as I've said before, Curt Cignetti has a black ops unit. 13 players for Indiana gained yards, contributed to success on offense. And those are just players that gained yards. We're not even talking about the offensive line. 5 starters, and offensive lines rotate every game. So you're probably talking about 20 players on offense, if not more, were involved in Indiana's success. That's how deep this team is. That they can rotate and not have that much of a drop-off. I mean, think about it. Curtis Rourke is, I think, much better than Taven Jackson. They still scored 24 offensive points against a Washington defense that is well-coached and underrated, and they were able to run the football and put together some big-time Big Ten-style drives. And on defense, 9 players made at least some type of sack. They generated some type of sack, TFL, or an interception or a pass deflected. And that's not even counting the players who were just tackling or who just were disciplined in coverage, so Will Rogers didn't even try to target them. Again, probably closer to 20 contributors there on that side of the ball. This is a deep team that can rotate, and they have upside too. Just look at Elijah Surratt, look at Omar Cooper Jr., look at Justice Ellison, who several times in this game gained extra yards out of seemingly nothing. Look at Tyson Lawton, Kalen Black, the depth at that running back room. Look at Mikael Kamara. Look at Tyreek Turner. You look at Linnell Carr Jr. And again, D'Angelo Pons, who's just kind of the epitome of this identity on defense, of being fundamentally sound, of punching above your weight class, and making plays when you can. Just this is special. This is special forces stuff. As I've said before, Deion Sanders brought Louis Vuitton to Colorado. He brought flash. He brought talent, athleticism, speed. And that has helped Colorado win. And then this year they've stepped up in the trenches. They have a better staff. They've done better on defense. So now they're really hitting their stride. And they're actually a good team. They're not an annoying meme like they are last year. They actually have some goodness to them. For Indiana, though, they have a black ops unit, because they may not have some of the high ceiling talent that Colorado does for individual players, but Indiana is much deeper. Much, much, much deeper. And they are much more fundamentally sound. You may not have Shedeur Sanders' upside or Travis Hunter's upside, or some would even say Shiloh Sanders' upside, although he's not nearly as good as those two are. But very few players for Indiana who are starting and making big plays have the floors that those players do. They don't have the same type of potential meltdowns, or they're not relied upon as much, so a mistake that they make isn't as severe. I hope you see what I'm saying. I'm not criticizing Colorado, by the way, when I say this. I'm actually kind of praising them, because I'm saying they're doing a good job. What I'm saying is the job that Indiana is doing is very exceptional, and it's time, as I've said for a week now, if not a little bit more, for people to pay attention to this Indiana squad. And last but not least, my game MVP for this game is, well, D'Angelo Pons, cornerback. He had 5 tackles, 3 solo, half tackle for loss, a pass defended, 2 interceptions, and a touchdown that really, from the gut, gave everyone the feeling, and rightfully so, that Indiana, regardless of how this game went, was going to find a way to win. So congratulations to D'Angelo Pons, the defense, the offense, Curt Cignetti, his staff, earning an 8th win. Only second time in program history where Indiana has won 8 games, or I think maybe or started off 8-0. And, well, we'll see where this all goes, but I have a feeling this is going to be a record-setting season and the best season ever in Indiana history. Thank you all so much for watching. So do remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Bresco Rascal, and Connor OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, Tyler, and I for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, Will Loftus for being All-Conference members. Make sure to check out my Patreon page, merchandise store, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, everyone. Go Hoosiers and go Huskies.